I'm a fast-talking PI, I'm a power-walking PI, I'm a demographic hieroglyphic fact-sheeting PI, I'm a theorizing PI, I'm a strategizing PI, I'm a published in a peer-reviewed journal PI, I'm a slot machine PI, I'm a lotto queen PI, I'm a tote ticket church bingo TAB PI, I'm a vegan PI, a rainbow warrior PI, I'm a protest sign against the rising waters PI, I'm a crim PI, behind the bar graphs PI, I'm a gun smoking patch toting king cobra PI, I'm a fale PI, I'm a marae PI, I'm a living breathing dwelling of my ancestors PI, I'm a diabetic PI.
Aloha, welcome to the third interview of the new Oceania interview series. Today is March 9th, 2015. My name is Craig Santos Perez. I'm the director of the creative writing program here at UH Manoa. We're joined today with a very special guest, Selina Tusitala Marsh. Can we give her a round of applause, please? We're excited for her performance tomorrow. She's visited a graduate class in Pacific Literature as well as conducted a workshop for some of our students. We're going to ask her questions related to her poetry, poetics, performance, scholarship, etc. First question for today. How and why did you become a poet?
Very good question. I think I captured that motivation in what I call my identity chant. And it comes from my name, Tusitala, one that I inherited from my Tuvaluan grandfather, means storyteller. And it was also used to refer to Robert Louis Stevenson, who lived his last years in Apia, Samoa, and was actually an activist on behalf of Samoan people for their independence from a New Zealand colonial government. So a really interesting figure. But the common thread is that, you know, we both tell stories. And so I think I was about 10 or 11 when I wrote my first poem. And it was an anti-nuclear protest poem. And it was published in a local neighbourhood magazine called Grapevine. It was a Christian magazine. And I submitted it, then forgot about it, and then about 3 weeks later it appeared in our letterbox. And when I opened it up and saw that the words that I had in my head were now in print, I kind of had an epiphany of the power of thought and printed voice. And I was really pleased, and then forgot about it. And then I would walk around the neighbourhood and people would go, hey, really loved that poem that you wrote, you know, the anti-nuclear poem. Great mushroom cloud in there. And it was like, wow, it goes beyond myself and out into the world. And then it becomes not mine, but theirs. And that sense of shared empowerment at the age of about 10 or 11 kind of always stuck with me. But then of course I got heavily into the school system, and the permission to create was kind of quashed, you know, and only certain people could be poets and only certain people could be writers. And it wasn't until really I encountered Pacific literature at university that I thought, wow, my voice could join others. Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about some of those first Pacific writers that you fell in love with or inspired you to keep writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think I encountered Patricia Grace and Witiki Hamaida before I encountered Albert Wendt. And Patricia Grace had a short story called Parade, which talks about representation. And there is an annual parade of that runs through this town, and this Māori group, this Māori family, get on the back of their truck and they dance and they do the haka and they do poi, and the granddaughter questions the grandmother about, you know, being these performing monkeys for these people going through the crowd, and the grandmother talks about the agency that we retain through the dignity of whatever we do, and that she wanted the parade to go ahead because this is who we are. And you can't control how people see you, but you just have to be who you are. And the granddaughter had a certain frame, you know, from kind of exposure to other ideas, which she was viewing it. And it made me feel really uncomfortable because I'm always thinking about the performance of identity, cultural identity, and it reminded me that we have agency, can't control how the world sees us, but if we're authentic with ourselves, we always have the power, we always have the agency. And then of course I encountered Albert Wen's Sons for the Return Home and kept thinking, where's the woman's story? Of course, right? Those are what those works are meant to do.
Right.
You know, someone puts a story out there, and we as a Pacific readership should be saying, you know, where's my story? And I think that kind of, you know, we were talking about poetics before, that kind of go write your own thing is present through all my work. So that another signature poem, Fast Talking PI, an identity chant, it's accretive and it keeps building and building. Whenever students come up to me and say, oh, you didn't do the Under the Bridge PI, Living Off Welfare PI, and I said, well, write your own, add to it.
Right.
You know, I welcome your voice, build it, bring it.
I love that idea. And you know, speaking of Fast Talking PI, can you tell us a little bit more about the construction of that book as a whole and how you brought those poems together and kind of more of the nuts and bolts for some of our young writers out there?
Right, yeah. Well, I've got an article that you can access online through the New Zealand Electronic Poetry Centre, that's NZEPC, and if you just Google I Come Going, that's the name of the article. It talks about the genesis of that particular poem, starting from hearing Anne Waldman's poem, Fast Speaking Woman, who was in turn inspired by Maria Sabina's chants, prayers, songs. And I really like the genealogy of chant and identity and vocalization and rhythm. And there's something inherent about the beat that crosses over gender boundaries, cultural boundaries, that gets people feeling like they belong in the poem somewhere. It opens up access because the majority of people that I come across don't feel that poetry is for them, they cannot access it. And a lot of my scholarship is about giving people tools to wedge open a window or maybe a door and connect with a poem or an idea that way, rather than kind of scaring them off with language or, I mean, but that's not to say I don't do experimental poetry and, you know, love language, but there's kind of ways and means to get ideas across. So Fast Talking PI really came out of the need to be a proud PI, to actually to connect with the other idea about having agency in your own representation, to mark a space that reflected exactly who I was. And that was a Pacific Islander from non-Pacific peoples and also from Pacific peoples. You know, because I'd never quite come across a Samoan who was just like me, and we're all very different, we're not just one homogenous group. But during my kind of politicization at university, I started wanting to be 110% Samoan for the people, you know. And the pendulum kind of swung in the middle when I started thinking, actually, that's not my reality. I'm not authentically that kind of Samoan. I'm actually this kind of Samoan. And so there's a lot of lines in that identity chart that is exactly who I am. And a lot of recent Pacific literature, particularly Samoan literature, has been trying to make or clear space for the Afakasi voice. And, you know, we've had Grace Tewila Taylor's Afakasi Speaks recently published, a really important collection for clearing that space. Lots of people have talked about Afakasi before her, of course. It's always been a very controversial term. And I had a number of conversations with my mentor, Albert Wendt, and he didn't like the term because to him it was racist. And from his particular cultural context, historical context, that term was extremely derogative and used against people. And we'd have these conversations about, but we're reclaiming that term. And the reason awhakasi won't die is because it speaks to a hybridity, that's another controversial term, but it speaks to a blending where people don't want to choose either or, and they want the kind of weight of that history because they've come through that weight. And so it's really interesting, and Albert was kind of seeing the point, but he doesn't need to agree with me, and I don't need to agree with him. It's all about adding our voices together. But as an awhakasi Samoan, that collection reflects my reality and does the work that I can do towards empowering Pacific peoples. You know, I might not be able to sing or dance or perform in ways that people would immediately identify as being, you know, Pacifica, but I'm in an English department and still the only brown face there, doing what I can to raise awareness about Pacific literature, voices, and critical tools that might be used to unpack that literature.
Well, it's definitely something I love about your Fast Talking PI collection, is that it does have a diverse range of identities that are being articulated, a diverse range of styles. So it's an engaging collection throughout. You know, you explore lots of different poetic techniques that I think give lots of, you know, Pacific writers or poets many options in terms of how they want to express themselves. We don't have to express ourselves in one way. And so, following up on that thought, you know, you are an amazing performer, and so I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your performance style, maybe some theories you have about performance, ways to, you know, engage with audience, perhaps, or ways to kind of work with different vocalizations as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no spam poet.
We'll forgive you for that. We'll feed you while you're here.
But what I love about the performance of Spam is the engagement of two different kinds of voices, right? Because you've got two different kinds of people there. I think that the tone of your voice can tell a story, you know. And we've got like critical books out there theorizing about poetry slam, for instance, spoken word poetry and the aesthetics of it. And the thing that commonly comes up is, which I've always found to be a struggle, is you've got the quality of authenticity on one hand, and the performance, the practiced, rehearsed performance on the other hand. And I've always kind of wondered how you can do both, you know, how you can keep it real, but keep it extremely polished and professional. And the only way that I can describe it, and it's going to sound really airy-fairy new agey, is that when the gods align and I'm on a stage and I look out there, I feel this immense love pouring out. I know, it sounds kooky, but I do. I feel an immense alofa for the people who are sitting there, and I just want to reach out and connect them with my voice, my journey, my idea, my story. And it doesn't happen all the time, but a large majority of the time it does. And I relate that back to kind of getting on that kind of, it's the wrong metaphor, but that super highway, that freeway of the va, that interrelational space between two people, between a person and their environment, between groups of people. You know, it's all about communication for me, and a service, right? And I think the other thing that I've been thinking about lately in terms of what's out there at the moment, and this is a really hard it's a tightrope act, is how do you also keep your humility? Because without that humility, you can't serve, you know, who you're writing for. Whether they're physically present or not, it's kind of irrelevant.
Right.
in Pacific Health Scholarship at Auckland University, they talk about key principles for research methodologies at Pacific Health. And the first four they mentioned just blew my mind. So the first one was alofa, humility, service, reciprocity. This is in Pacific Health research. And the reason that they're there is because there are real people behind the words, behind the statistics. And I thought, right, if it can work there, then it can work in Pacific literature. It can work in this environment, and it should work because behind the words are people and lives and stories. So I guess everything comes back to that, the incorporation of a rhythm, the tones in my voice. It's almost like I want to lull people in to a safe space so that they're open to some quite jarring ideas. And I don't sing. I love singing. I'm a shower singer, but it's almost like a calling out of connection. And I can't really break it down into kind of practice-based techniques, because how do you break down alofa? How do you break down love? And it is a performance, and I say performance because I rehearse. One of my closest friends, Tusitala, has a stunning poem, Wild Dogs Under My Skirt. She's been performing it for years, but every single time I go to an event with her and she performs that poem, she's in the bathroom performing it in the mirror. She doesn't take for granted that space. She's a perfectionist and a professional, and I so admire that, because you are there to serve, So I get a little bit impatient with poets who rock up and, and kind of flicking through, and, and that might make me old school as well, But it's a respect that you need to kind of have towards your audience.
Well, I'm looking forward to your performance tomorrow, for sure. You better rehearse.
Well, the other thing too is that it's like the workshop that I took. Like, I had multiple ways I could have run that workshop, but I needed to hear and respond to what was in the room, right? And so tomorrow will be the same thing as well. I'll pick up on the aura, I'll pick up on the energy, and I'll respond to that. So it's important for me too that even though I will practice key poems, I'm going to be also led by the spirit, so to speak.
Right. Well, I definitely hope you'll read some from your most recent collection, Dark Sparring. So can you talk a little bit about maybe the major themes or different techniques you're exploring in that newest collection?
Yeah. Well, the wonderful thing about poetry is that you get to share with the world your own journey. And I had another epiphany, that's kind of like one of my favorite words, kind of a bolt from the sky during my mother's funeral. And we had my mother's body in our family home for a week. And the Tuvalu side of the family came on the last, although they were there throughout, but they all gathered on the last day, and we were about to take the body to the funeral parlour and have the service, and they said, well, we need to farewell Mum's body, she needs to be facing north, or she was facing north anyway, and they started doing a traditional, well-known Tuvalu dance, the whaatele. And my sister and I had never performed the whaatele before, but the aunties pulled us up, the uncles sat down, fold leg, rolled up the mats, and just began this rhythmic beat, really slow. The women started singing, and we started doing these actions really slow, very gently, and then they got faster and faster and faster, and then they kind of reached this moment of euphoria, and then it just stopped, right? And it was done. The work was done. And it was just, I was just buzzing after that. I thought, My body hadn't moved like that. No one had left Mum's side. My body hadn't moved like that. There was something about the connection, the cultural connection, the singing, the chanting, the rhythm, and the movement that actually helped me respond to what had happened to my mother in such an intimate, instinctive way. You know, I didn't have the cultural context at that time. And so that stayed with me. And soon after she died, a lot of grief, a lot of regret, because I wasn't there when she passed. I was in the neighbourhood, but I wasn't physically there. And so a friend had introduced me to Muay Thai kickboxing. And it was such an asinine idea. I just thought, what the, you know, I'm a poet, a peace lover. I've never hit anyone in my life. You know, I'm gentle, placid. But there's something, you know, I like to thrive in my discomfort zone, you know, because that's how you grow, right? And it hurts when your bones are growing. I used to be told all the time, oh, it's just, you know, growing pains. So that, at that apex, you know, of pain and pleasure is where you kind of get the growth. And so I took up this kickboxing, and I've never looked back. And again, for 2 years, it helped me physically embody the mourning, the loss, the grief, and actually at the end, the reclamation of life again, you know. And I saw parallels between those two forms of being, those two forms of culture. And I'd forgotten about the body. You know, we're, as scholars and poets, we're so in our heads we forget about the body. But 2 UH students took me on a hike a few days ago up Oromana Peak, and I certainly could not forget about the body at that hike when I was clinging onto the side of a boulder, looking down at the tops of trees, thinking, okay, I could lose my life here, but I'm embracing life fully. So.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today for this interview. I think your poetry, your performance, your scholarship, your teaching definitely embodies life, brings new movement, you know, to different groups, different communities, different audiences. And, you know, myself and I know so many other fans of yours are so grateful that, you know, you kind of live your poetics that are dedicated to, you know, to alofa, to service, to humility, and to really empowering our peoples as we move through the 21st century.
Amen.
So mahalo, and we hope you enjoyed the rest of your time here in Hawaii, and safe travels.